I never thought I'd see the day my own husband would lock me out of the house I paid for. But there I was, standing on the porch, suitcase in hand, staring at the man I once believed I'd grow old with. I'd worked double shifts for 20 years to help pay off that mortgage. Every ache in my back, every night I came home to cold leftovers. It was all for that house. And when the final payment cleared, Ray smiled at me like he'd been waiting for that moment. Only to tell me I wasn't welcome there anymore. He said he needed space. And by space, he meant the 20-something waitress he'd been seeing behind my back. But you see, I wasn't raised to shout or beg. I was raised to wait, to listen, and when the time came, to act quietly, so that justice could echo louder than words ever could. I remember the morning we signed for the place, like it was a small, bright present wrapped in a paper bag. Ray and I drove down to the county office in his old pickup, the one with the dented fender and the radio that only sometimes found a station. We laughed like two kids with a secret, because for the first time the future felt real. We stamped our names on a stack of papers, and the clerk pushed a small, official-looking document across the counter. "Home," she said, and it sounded softer than I expected, like a promise someone else had said out loud so it could finally belong to us. We were younger then. I had just picked up an extra night shift at the hospital, and Ray was working at the garage down on Vine Street, turning wrenches until his knuckles were raw. We didn't have much. Rusted tools, a chipped set of dishes, a sagging couch that had been my grandmother's. But the mortgage was ours, and that mattered. It made a home out of a house. Every month, when the bill came, we sat at that scarred kitchen table and balanced the numbers like it was a prayer. We marked off the checks in a little ledger I kept in the bottom drawer, the one with the missing handle. There was comfort in the routine. There was pride. I worked long hours. Nursing isn't an easy life, but it gave me a kind of steady. I liked the rhythm of it. The hum of fluorescent lights. The whisper of pages as charts were turned. The quiet concentration of people who needed tending. Sometimes I would come home with the smell of antiseptic still on my sleeves, and Ray would be there with 2 mugs of coffee waiting, his face soft in the lamplight. He'd put a hand on my shoulder and say, "You did good today." Those small words held a lot. They were the kind of things that made the house feel like a harbor. For a while, everything fit together. We planted a small garden out back, tomatoes that never seemed to ripen all at once, and a stubborn rose bush that lived through 2 winters. On Sundays, we'd sit on the front steps with iced tea and watch the neighborhood children ride their bikes, shouting and skidding and calling to one another. Ray would tell stories about a car he'd fixed, or about something ridiculous the boss at the garage had said that morning. He had a way of making the ordinary sound entertaining. I'd laugh, and the sound would scatter like coins across the porch. But life has a way of rearranging itself, slowly, and then all at once. Ray's hours at the garage started to shrink. Customers who'd once known him by name began to take their cars elsewhere. Fancy shops with newer lifts, mechanics who could plug a laptop into an engine and make it sing. Ray wasn't a laptop kind of man. He was grease under the fingernails, muscle memory in the wrist. The garage that had been his pride choked on debts he kept saying he'd catch up on. I remember the nights he would come home and sit at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, and I would reach across and smooth his hair. Because what else do you do when a person you love is exhausted? Sometimes he'd say, "Don't worry, I'll get it right." And sometimes, when the money was tight and the fridge hummed a little too loudly, he'd bite his lip and hush his own worries like they were childish things that couldn't touch us. I started picking up a few more shifts. The hospital needed someone. I needed the hours. I gave overtime checks to the mortgage, tucked them into envelopes, slid them into the ledger drawer where the missing handle made the wood whisper when you closed it. It felt good to know the house was safe. It felt like I was building something solid for the 2 of us. A place where our bones could finally rest. There were nights, though, when I'd catch a look in Ray's eye I didn't recognize. It was small at first, a flicker when he thought I wasn't looking, the way his mouth set at the edges when a check came due. Once, after a long day, I set my hand on the small of his back, and he flinched as if I had moved too quickly. "Work's getting to me," he said. "I'm tired." I didn't press. What could I even say that would help? I knew his pride. I'd seen how he held himself up against the world, how he would rather skip a meal than admit he needed help. Love, in those years, felt like a quiet trade. I gave him steady paychecks and a warm supper, and he gave me loyalty and laughter. That balance began to tip without either of us noticing. When the repairs at the garage cost more than the work coming in, Ray started to retreat into silence. He'd come home later, sometimes with the smell of another woman's perfume on his shirt that he'd shake off like lint. He'd make excuses about late nights, about the boss needing him to stay. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. I've always been someone who gives people the space to explain themselves. I told myself I was being silly, that we'd weather this the way we always had. Still, the house felt different. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the stairs. Everything sounded like it was listening. There were practical signs, too. Bills left unopened on the counter, an envelope here, a note there. I would smooth them and tuck them into my ledger because I liked things in their place. Ray began talking about selling a few tools, about pawn shops and quick cash, and I would nod like I was helping. It's strange how denial gets dressed up as patience. I told myself these were just small storms. People get tired. People make mistakes. We were fine, I believed. I needed to believe it. I come from a family that values work and stubbornness. My mother used to say that houses are built on more than nails. They're built on people who keep showing up. That phrase is what I clung to when the nights were hardest. I'd sit at the kitchen table with the ledger open and the porch light on, balancing numbers and humming old hymns under my breath. Sometimes, when the neighborhood was asleep and the house held its breath, I would get up and stand at the window and look at the street lamp's halo. I'd think about the way dust motes moved in that light, how even the smallest things found their place. It used to calm me. It started to feel like a map of everything I had given. There were moments, small and honest, that reminded me of the old warmth. Ray would bring home a single daffodil from the gas station, a ridiculous thing that left me laughing. We'd put it in a jar on the windowsill, and the whole kitchen would seem to breathe with it. Those were the days I tucked away in the deepest part of my heart. The good, the tender, the ordinary. The rest I tried not to fixate on. I thought the hurt would wear itself out, that the holes would stitch over with living. What I didn't know was how much his resentment had been knitting itself, how it had grown teeth and a plan. People don't always announce their change. Sometimes it just arrives, like a season slipping into another, and you wake up, and the map you thought you'd been following is no longer accurate. Ray started to speak with a different tone, sharper, quick to anger at little things I'd done for years. He'd criticize the way I folded shirts, or how I left the porch light on, or how I cooked the gravy too thick. Those were silly grievances, petty things that suggested something deeper. Love, I learned, can be quiet as a secret and loud as a lie. Even so, I kept hope. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the years of caring for others that made me believe tending would fix what was broken. Nurses are trained to see behind the surface, to notice a pulse that's too slow, to listen to the admitted discomfort that hides deeper pain. I listened to Ray. I told him we'd get through it. I picked up extra shifts, rearranged my days, and paid in ways that left my bones tired but my conscience clear. I poured what I had into the house because I believed truly that the house was the anchor for the life we'd promised each other. There were nights I would stand on the back steps and count the ways we had built our life. The first paycheck we used as a down payment. The winter we double-dog dared ourselves to turn down the heat a degree to save money. The year I surprised him with a new set of wipers because the rain kept stealing visibility. I told myself these things mattered. They did. They still do. They are the stitches in the fabric of a life shared. Yet even as I recounted them, the pull in my chest that something was slipping away grew stronger. I used to believe love was a steady current, something that carried you without too much effort. Now I understand it better. Love is work, yes, but it's also witness. It's watching someone when they are small and frightened and still loving them through whatever they become. I watched Ray through the years as lines settled at his eyes and his laugh became rarer. I watched how pride corroded him when the world turned and didn't wait. I watched the way silence became his conversation. Still, hope is a stubborn companion. I held tight to it because to let go felt like admitting defeat. I kept paying, kept tending, kept saying the small things that mean so much on a Tuesday night. Did you eat? Do you need me to bring you a sandwich? How was the day? It's surprising how much of a life is made up of those tiny, steady moments. They accumulate into something that looks like loyalty. They become proof. If I had known what was waiting around the corner, I might have acted differently. Maybe I would have asked more questions. Maybe I would have pulled at the threads a little harder. But hindsight is a teacher after the fact. At the time, I was doing the only thing I knew how to do. Keeping the house. Paying the bills. Believing in the promise we had made when the clerk pushed that paper across the counter and said, "Home." I believed that promise the way you believe a child who tells you the sun will come back after the rain. So I kept at it. I kept the ledger, and I kept the faith, and I planted seeds in the yard that refused to be rushed. In the quiet of the nights, I would imagine us old and gray on that porch, rocking slowly and telling grandchildren stories that always had a laugh. That image anchored me. It felt like the most honest picture of our future, but like the seasons we couldn't control. Time was rearranging the landscape of our lives, and the small fissures were starting to become visible. I could feel the air change, like a storm on a summer evening when the cicadas hush and the sky gathers itself. I didn't know yet how deep the cracks would run. I only knew that something inside the house was shifting, and I was paying attention. The day I paid off the mortgage is a day I still can see as if it's been lit from the inside. It wasn't dramatic. There were no balloons or trumpet fanfare. Just the small, private ritual of me sitting at our kitchen table with a stack of paperwork and a cup of coffee gone lukewarm. I had been planning it for months, saving every overtime check, every small bonus, pinching pennies until the corners of my budget felt sharp. I'd told no one, not because I wanted a secret, but because I wanted it to be a surprise, a quiet gift to the two of us for all those years of stubborn keeping and steady paying. My retirement had come in as a modest check, nothing that would set anyone's world on fire. I'd added it to the little pile of savings I'd tucked away in a separate account. It seemed right to use what I had earned, what I had delayed for, to finally lay the mortgage to rest. When I filled in the last payment slip and handed it to the bank teller, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in years. There was a sound to it, a small, satisfied click like a latch being set. The woman behind the counter stamped my form and smiled. And I smiled back because, for once, the math closed perfectly, and the ledger showed what I had hoped for: zero balance. I drove home slowly, the radio off, thinking about the porch light and Ray's laugh, picturing him coming through the door with a joke about something small. I wanted to surprise him. I had even wrapped the final statement in a ribbon from the craft box. Ridiculous, I know. But some part of me needed it to be ceremonious. We had earned this. We had worked for this house in ways that went beyond money, in all the small trades of life. I thought of the ledger in the bottom drawer, the way the wood sighed when I closed it, and I felt like I was finally closing a chapter we had both written. When I walked in the door that afternoon, Ray was at the kitchen counter, leaning on the edge with a bill in his hand. He looked up at me, and there was that small, guarded look I'd seen more and more lately. He gave me a soft, tired smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You home early?" he asked. "I finished a few hours at the clinic," I said. I set the envelope on the counter and watched him pick at the corner of a paper. He didn't take the ribboned packet immediately. He folded the bill and set it down like it was just another thing on the table. I felt the air change a fraction, as if the room had slightly tilted. "Sit down," I said. "I want you to see something." He obliged, but not the way he used to. He sat with his back a little straighter, as if preparing himself for news he suspected and didn't want. I untied the ribbon and slipped the bank statement out, watching him as if I could read his future in the way he read his mail. I told him, slow and careful the way you tell someone a truth you want them to keep. "Ray," I said, "we're done. Mortgage is clear. For a moment he didn't respond. He folded his hands, looked at the statement, then at me, and there was a small, almost imperceptible tightening around his mouth. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, measured, like someone reading off a list. That's good, he said. That's something. I watched for the warmth that had always followed these things. I'd expected a laugh, maybe a clumsy hug, and I told you so. Instead, Ray's shoulders seemed to lower as if a weight had been allowed to set down. But the expression that settled on his face wasn't relief. It was something edged and distant. He set the paper down carefully, as if afraid to crease it, and then he stood up and walked to the sink, started rinsing a coffee mug like he needed something to do. You okay? I asked, feeling my voice try to anchor the moment. He shrugged, not meeting my eyes. Feels like a cage, Evelyn. It took me a beat to process that. Cage for a house? For the home we'd labored over, for the porch and the garden and the ledger and the drawer. A cage? I repeated, like a person echoing a foreign word. I was smiling then because I thought he was making a joke. A sudden oddity of expression that would dissolve in a laugh. But Ray didn't laugh. He kept rinsing the mug, his fingers sure and methodical. I don't know, he said. It's just, I keep thinking about traveling. Getting away, seeing what's out there. He put the mug in the dish rack and turned to face me. Don't get me wrong. I love this place. I don't want to feel stuck. Do you understand? I did understand, in a way. I knew what restlessness felt like. I remembered the years when he'd driven across state lines to fetch an obscure part, the way his eyes would light up talking about a car that ran like new. But the way he said it, like the house was a thing that belonged to him alone, like our years were a chain. Something in me tightened. We earned this, I told him. We both did. He nodded slowly. Yeah, I know. He stopped, and the rest of the sentence dissolved. There was a pause where I expected reassurance. Instead, there was the kind of silence that lives between two people when words have become thin. I tried to find the humor in it, to tilt the moment back into something we could share. So, I said, putting my hands on the counter to steady myself, we can finally take that trip to Savannah, like we talked about. His jaw worked. Maybe, we'll see. It was a small, evasive answer. But at the time I took it for what I wanted it to be. A worry of his making light because he didn't want to seem ungrateful. I told myself I was lucky. Plenty of people never get to pay off their houses. Plenty of people would love what we had. I let myself feel grateful. I tried to push the prickling at the base of my neck back down. But over the next few days, the atmosphere at home kept reminding me of that word. Cage. It echoed in the way Ray walked past rooms without looking, in the way he kept checking his phone even when we were sitting on the porch. He seemed restless in a way I couldn't soothe. He would make little comments about closing up early at the garage, about needing to think about something different. He started to come home later and later, with the smell of cigarettes clinging to him more often, even though he'd promised to quit years ago. One afternoon he left the television on and went out to the shed. I walked into the living room, and the final mortgage statement was still on the coffee table where I'd left it. I smoothed the paper with my hand the way my mother used to smooth linens, an automatic private gesture. The house felt full of echoes, my footsteps, the creak of the third stair, the hollow thud of keys left in the bowl. I put the statement back in the drawer, but the feeling that had come with it lingered like a smell you can't quite place. I started noticing other things. A receipt in the glove compartment for a dinner I hadn't been invited to. A lipstick on the collar of his jacket he insisted was a smear from a mechanic's rag. Little things that can be explained away, and yet they kept collecting until they made a small, undeniable pattern. I found myself watching him the way a nurse watches a patient whose vitals are wavering. Careful, attentive, trying not to alarm them until you're sure what's wrong. When I brought up the dinner receipt casually, he said with a shrug, it was business. When I asked about the lipstick, he made a joke and deflected. I wanted to trust his jokes because they were part of the man I married. It's what made his heat bearable. The humor. the way he could take a raw edge and smooth it. But this was different. The jokes had a brittle quality, and when he laughed, it sounded like someone filling a cavity in a fence. Functional. Hollow. I kept thinking about that word again and again. Cage. And how different people can wear the same word like a cloak or a stone. To him, perhaps, the house represented comfort he feared would make him small. To me, it was everything I had given. I had always seen our mortgage as an investment in a shared life, a place for family, for quiet, for the ends of things. He saw a horizon he thought he had the right to chase. Our visions for what the house meant were beginning to diverge. There were mornings I would watch him over breakfast, the steam from my coffee blurring his profile, and I would try to imagine what part of him felt boxed in. I tried to remember the day we stood at that county counter and felt the future in our hands. Back then, the world had seemed full of possibility, not prisons. Could it be that time and hardship had changed how he perceived freedom? I wanted to ask him, to sit and talk until we had reached the same map again. But conversation became short, and we both seemed afraid of where it might lead. One evening, after a long shift at the hospital, I came home to find Ray at the sink, the radio on low with some country song playing. He was humming along but not really listening. He glanced at me and said, almost offhand, "You know, sometimes I wish things had been different. My dad used to talk about leaving town until things calmed down. Maybe that's just the way I think." "What do you mean?" I asked. And there it was. That small seed of alarm that I refused to let take root. "Different how?" He shrugged. "Just less tied down. Not that this isn't nice. I don't know. It's heavy sometimes." "Everything feels heavy if you're carrying it all by yourself," I said softly. "Tell me when it's too much, Ray. We can get through things." He looked at me then, and for a second I caught the old man I loved, the one who had lifted engines and made people laugh. But the look shifted quickly, like a car switching lanes. "I'll be fine," he said. It was the kind of promise I wanted to believe. I wanted to hold on to the image of us on the porch in our old age, the sound of grandchildren's laughter, the comfort of a life recognized. I clung to that image because it had steadied me before, and I needed steadiness now. But there was an undercurrent, a small, persistent current that tugged at my ankles whenever I thought about the future. The ledger sat in its drawer like a quiet sentinel, and the house hummed with the memory of every check and coin that had gone into it. I told myself I was being unfair, that I was looking too hard for a fracture where there could be none, but the way he had said the word cage would not let go of me. It had a shape to it. The line of conversation between us had shifted. I tried to summon the easy comfort of our earlier years, the way we used to laugh at bad television and argue about the right way to frost a cake. I tried to find the humor in the small things, like I always had. But the thought of the house being a cage sat heavy in my chest, and I realized, with a small, sinking clarity, that something about our once-shared dream had begun to feel like it belonged to someone else. I came home early that Tuesday because the clinic had called and asked if I could cover a lunch shift for someone. It was one of those favors that seemed small at the time, a way to help a coworker so I could get home before the heat built up. I remember thinking about how nice it would be to walk in and see Ray puttering at the bench or sitting on the porch with that goofy grin he gets when the neighbor's dog does something ridiculous. I wanted to bring home a roast I'd bought on sale, something slow and comforting, the kind of dinner that makes the kitchen smell like Sunday even in the middle of the week. The house felt quieter than usual when I opened the door. The radio was off. The light in the hallway was dim. I set the grocery bag down on the counter and noticed, almost at the same moment, the purse. It wasn't like any purse I'd seen in our kitchen before. Smaller, glossy, with a brass clasp and a delicate pattern that caught the light. It sat right on top of the counter like it belonged there, as if it had always been part of the landscape. My hands went to the ribbon I'd used to tie the mortgage statement weeks earlier. But instead of finding the ribbon, I found the purse, and something in my chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. I called out, "Ray?" And my voice sounded ordinary. I wanted it to be ordinary. He answered from the back room, his voice casual, like someone who had practiced sounding casual. "In here," he called. I walked through the living room and into the kitchen. Ray was standing by the sink with a screwdriver in his hand, shirt sleeves rolled up, as if he had been working on something mechanical in the middle of the afternoon. He looked up when I came in, and his face was one I'd come to know so well, the face of a man who could be tender and stubborn in the same breath. He didn't smile. He set the screwdriver down slowly, like someone who had rehearsed how to set a thing down without seeming too intentional. "Hey," I said, and the word landed in the air between us like a bird that didn't know where to go. "I covered lunch. I thought I stopped because the purse was a punctuation mark I hadn't expected." He glanced at it and then back at me. "Oh," he said, "that." The way he said it made me feel suddenly like a visitor in a house I'd been living in for years. He walked over and picked up a dish towel, folding it in his hands, pretending to be absorbed in the cloth. "Someone left their purse," he said. "She must have come by for something and left in a hurry." He didn't sound worried. He sounded like he was explaining a minor inconvenience. "Ray, whose is it?" I asked, but the question felt small. I already knew how to read him. I could feel the change in the air, the slight hesitation in his posture, the careful measurement in his voice. He was not the sort of man who left a stranger's purse on the counter without a word. He hesitated. Then, with that half-smile that has always been his way of hiding things, he said, "It's not important. Don't worry about it." But I did worry. I had been worrying for some time. A low, persistent ache like a tooth that keeps reminding you it's there. I moved closer to the counter, reached out my hand, and brushed the purse as if to check for dust. The leather was warm. Someone had been holding it recently. Inside I could see a glimpse of a lipstick case and a folded receipt from a cafe down by the river. The receipt had a timestamp from earlier that afternoon. "You were at the cafe?" I asked, more because I wanted to hear the sound of his answer than because I needed the information. "Wasn't me," he said, brisk now. "She stopped by while you were still at work. Figured she left in a hurry." There's a way people speak when they're trying to be blithe that ends up sounding brittle. I searched his face then, looking for any sign that he would step in and say what I wanted to hear, that this was a mistake, that he would laugh and apologize, that we would return to the easy rhythm we'd always had. But his expression was a folded thing, his eyes avoiding mine like a child hiding a scraped knee. I picked up the purse, held it like evidence, and there it was, a smell, faint and floral, a whisper of someone else's perfume. I set it gently back down as if it might crack, like something fragile that held more than its weight. "Did you want me to call her?" I asked, my voice steady even though my hands trembled a little. "No," he said. "No, it's fine." He pinched the bridge of his nose then, a small, annoyed motion I'd only seen when he'd been particularly frustrated with a stubborn engine. "Evelyn, we need to talk." Sometimes when someone says that, you can tell they're trying to prepare you for something kind and difficult. This wasn't that kind of talk. The air tightened like a string pulled taut. "About what?" I asked. He swallowed, and when he spoke his voice was flat, deliberate. "About us. About the house. About moving on." The words came like a sudden wind. They didn't make sense together in the way I wanted them to. "Moving on?" I echoed. He nodded, and for the first time in a long time, he looked older in the way that leaves look older when frost settles on them. "Yeah, I think it's time you moved on. It's time." I set the grocery bag down and steadied myself on the counter. "Moved on where?" "Ray, what are you talking about?" He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded paper. He unfolded it slowly, and the motion felt theatrical, rehearsed. It was an official-looking document, paper slightly thick and stamped with a county seal. My heart began to hammer in a way that felt like a small animal trying to get out of me. "I handled the paperwork a while back," he said, "when things were messy and we were arguing about the garage. I put the deed in my name to make some payments easier. Just paperwork, Evelyn. It made the bank happy. It made life simpler." I stared at him, not understanding the edges of his words at first. You what? Ray, we paid this house together. I paid more than my share. You said... I know, he interrupted quick and sharp. I know you paid. But paperwork is paperwork. The house is in my name. For a moment, the room tilted. It was like being underwater and catching a glimpse of sunlight that tells you which way is up but doesn't give you breath. My mouth felt dry. You put the deed in your name without telling me? I heard the disbelief in my own voice. And with it, something else. Like the sting of being handed a thing you thought yours and told it never belonged to you. It was easier, he said. As if that explanation should fold everything back into place. I was fixing things, dealing with the boss. I took care of it. You were busy, working, doing what you always do. I thought it would be temporary. Temporary. The word hung like a curtain with a tear that let cold air through. Temporary? I repeated. So the house that I helped pay for, that I kept up, that I dreamed of growing old in, that could be changed on a piece of paper while I was at work? He looked like a man trying to catch a thought that had wandered away. I never thought you'd make a thing of it, he said. I thought you'd understand. I thought you'd be grateful. Grateful. The word hit me in a way I did not expect. Grateful? For being left out of a decision? For being treated like I wasn't part of it? My voice rose, not in volume so much as in an incredulousness that surprised me. I realized I had been speaking louder than I meant to, and immediately calmed myself. This was not a time for drama. Drama makes sound, and sound gives people reasons to deflect. He sighed. A long, tired sound. I didn't mean to hurt you. I just needed control of something. The garage is falling apart, and I thought if I handled the house stuff, maybe I could figure the rest out. But now it feels like I need something different. There are moments when betrayal doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It comes in small, precise acts. A paper signed without consent. A name written where another should be. A silence that stretches until the shape of your life fits someone else's hand. I felt the floor under me shift. For years I had trusted him the way you trust the hinge on a door, that it will bear the weight of opening and closing. He had unbolted that hinge and given the door to someone else. I wanted to scream. I wanted to call the lawyer who had once helped my sister, to demand, to tear up the documents and make things right. But instead of making a scene, I thought of picture albums, of the snapshots tucked away in the bottom of the linen closet, the wedding photos where we were both younger and looked a little frightened and a lot brave, the photo of a little boy with a gap-toothed smile who had once lived down the street, the image of a small crooked Christmas tree on our first winter here. Those were the things I could carry with me and still be myself. Do what you need to do, I said, and my voice was steady because I had decided it would be. I moved past him into the living room and began to gather things quietly. Photo albums first, the ones with the brittle edges and the dates in my handwriting. An old quilt our neighbor had made for us when we first moved in, stitched with names. I tucked them into a small suitcase I kept under the bed for surprise guests. The kind of guest that never came. Ray watched me, and in his eyes I could see a flicker of something like shame and something like relief, as if a burden he'd carried in secret had finally been acknowledged. He did not touch me. He did not stop me. He simply watched as I folded memories into fabric and paper and placed them into the suitcase. "You're leaving?" he asked finally, as if the act of naming it gave it a gentleness it did not deserve. "I'm going," I said. For a little while. The lie tasted bitter in my mouth, but I needed him to think I was the sort of person who left quietly, who maintained dignity instead of making noise. I put my hand on the suitcase handle and felt the weight of everything that had been ours, now precariously mine to carry alone. I walked out of the house without slamming doors, without throwing accusations, without making a spectacle. I carried the suitcase to the car, and as I closed the trunk, I paused and looked at the porch, at the swing where we had once promised one another everything, at the rose bush that still had a stubborn bud. The sun was soft and gold and ordinary, like the world had not shifted at all. People walked dogs down the street. A child rode by on a scooter and shouted at the top of his lungs. Life continued as if nothing had happened. I drove to a small motel on the edge of town. I put the suitcase on the bed and sat down on its edge, feeling suddenly very old and very tired. I unfolded one of the photo albums and traced the pictures with my finger, the way a nurse checks a pulse. The pictures were a map. They were proof of a life built together. And in that moment, in the quiet of a room that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and motel soap, I felt more alone than I had in years, but I also felt something else. A small, stubborn flame that did not go out. It was a clarity more than a plan, a recognition that remaining in hurt did not suit me. I had left with what mattered most. My memories, my dignity, and the knowledge that I had not stolen a single penny, that every payment had been mine to claim in the ledger of my life. As the evening settled, I made a cup of tea in the motel's chipped kettle and sat at the small table by the window, the photograph album open like a promise. I turned each page slowly, remembering the smell of the kitchen when the first loaf of bread had come out of the oven, the way Ray's hands had trembled when he held our daughter for the first time, the sound of laughter that had once filled these rooms. The hurt was a hard, clean thing, but under it was a steadiness I had not expected. A quiet knowledge that endings are sometimes beginnings dressed in old clothes. When I closed the album, I did not know the shape of what would come next. I only knew that the house had been taken from me in a papered, quiet way, and that I had a choice about how to meet that theft. I chose to leave without fury, not because I was weak, but because I wanted my anger to be measured and true when it finally spoke. I wanted my actions to be the sort that would not need to shout to be heard. I found a little apartment above a bakery 2 blocks from the clinic. It was small. 1 bedroom, a window that looked out over the alley where the delivery trucks idled in the morning, and a radiator that clanked like an old clock. The first night I moved in, I opened a suitcase of photographs and spread them on the table like a map. I slept on the couch because it felt like less of a change that way, as if I was someone visiting, rather than someone who'd been pushed out. The apartment smelled of yeast and coffee, and the kind of forgiveness that comes with a fresh loaf. It was quiet in a way the house had stopped being. Quiet that wasn't full of other people's voices, or the jangling of keys in a bowl that suddenly didn't belong to me. I told myself I would breathe first and plan second. That was the rhythm of my life as a nurse. Assess, don't panic, then act. So I made tea, sat at the small kitchen table, and opened the album until the photographs blurred into one another. I counted the money I had in the bank, balanced it against bills, and then I did something I hadn't done in years. I made a list. Not a ledger for the mortgage this time, but a plan of steps. Call a friend, get records, find out exactly what that deed said, get proof of payment, consult someone who knew about papers and law. The list felt like armor. The friend I thought of first was Harold Jennings. Years ago, when he was a shy clerk at the county records office, he'd had a heart attack, and I'd tended to him in the hospital. He was the sort of man who kept his life in neat files and quiet routines. After the hospital, he'd invited me to coffee more than once, and we'd talked about everything from the weather to the small injustices people carry. I remembered his hands, the hands of someone who loved order. I called him the next morning. "Harold?" I asked when he picked up, and his voice was lighter than I expected. "It's Evelyn. Evelyn!" "My goodness, how are you?" He sounded pleased the way someone is when a long-ago favor comes back like a visiting card. "I need a favor," I said simply. "Do you have time to talk?" Harold came by that afternoon. He sat at the little kitchen table in my apartment and sipped tea like a man who believed in slow things. I told him what had happened, all of it. The purse on the counter, the deed, the way Ray had folded his hands and said the house was in his name. I watched Harold's face the way a nurse watches a wound. He didn't flinch, but his hands tightened around the mug. "That sounds complicated," he said at last. "But paperwork usually tells a story. You paid, you say? There should be a trail somewhere. Canceled checks, bank deposits, tax statements. If the payments came from an account in your name, that's something." "How do we find that trail?" I asked. Harold smiled slightly, the way a book lover smiles when someone asks about a rare volume. "We start where the paperwork lives," he said. "County office, recorder of deeds, chain of title, and then we follow the money." He gave me a list, things to request, forms to fill, Small bureaucratic rituals that would feel like bricks in a wall. He told me which envelopes to open first. Mortgage payoff statement, bank statements for the years in question, copies of canceled checks if possible, and any correspondence with the bank. He suggested I call the bank and request a transaction history. He warned me gently that some of these things would cost small fees, and that patience would be the most valuable currency. Paperwork takes its own time, he said, and it doesn't like to be rushed. I slept better after Harold left. He had a way of naming things that turned them from frightening into manageable. The next morning, I went to the clinic for a short shift, then took the bus down to the branch of our small local bank. I spoke with a teller and asked for copies of my account history for the past 20 years. She blinked like 20 years was a lot, which of course it was. But she took my request with the same quiet competence I'd come to expect in small towns. There were forms to fill, signatures to affix. I left a little older and a little more certain. Over the course of a week, I became a regular at offices I'd once never needed. The recorder's office was a small brick building with a flag that leaned to one side. The clerk at the window recognized Harold's name and smiled as if we were part of the same small constellation. We pulled the chain of title for our house. It was like reading a family tree printed on legal paper. Names, dates, stamps. I looked for our names together, the way you look for your footprints in the sand. There it was. Ray's name, dated to that time he'd told me he'd handled a transfer. The filing showed a deed transfer, and beside it, a scrawl that meant something official I didn't fully understand. But Harold explained it. "Looks like he recorded a transfer without your name on it," he said. "Sometimes people do that when they think it makes things easier. Sometimes there's a good reason, but sometimes it's wrong." "Wrong how?" I asked. "If your name is not on the current deed, that's a problem," Harold said softly. "But that doesn't mean your payments weren't yours. We'll need to prove that you paid the mortgage. We'll need bank statements, canceled checks, deposit slips, anything that shows the money came out of your account." I left the office clutching copies of the records like a small comfort. Having the pieces in my hand was its own kind of proof that the world still made sense. I ordered copies of canceled checks from the bank. The bank required a signed affidavit for older records, small fees that felt absurd, but not insurmountable. I sat at my little table at night and slid documents into a folder, tucking each one carefully like a letter. There were moments when the enormity of it would press down on me, when the stack of papers felt like trying to move a boulder with my fingertips. Those were the edges where doubt crept in. Would the bank cooperate? Would the deed hold up? Would anyone believe a woman who had spent a life caring for others when a man decided quietly to rearrange the names on a piece of paper? I had to remind myself of Harold's words. Paperwork tells a story. If you have the pages, you can tell it. While I collected the money trail, I also gathered softer things, neighbors who might remember, friends who could attest to my contributions, old receipts from hardware stores where I'd bought paint and a new set of porch steps. I walked to the house some evenings under the pretense of checking on the garden. The roses were stubbornly blooming, as if defiant. Mrs. Klein across the street would wave from her window and ask about the tomatoes. "You look good, Evelyn," she'd say. Not knowing everything she was saying felt like a benediction. Small kindnesses accumulate like rain. My mornings were spent at the clinic and my afternoons at offices and banks. I learned the rhythm of waiting rooms and the chant of copy machines. I made friends with the woman at the public records desk who could find an obscure filing in under a minute, and the paralegal at the legal aid office who took my list and nodded, as if she had heard versions of this story many times. She recommended I speak with a lawyer who did pro bono work for seniors. "You don't have to go in firing shots," she said. "Start by asking questions. See what the options are. Sometimes people sign things without knowing. Sometimes deeds are recorded improperly. Sometimes there's room to fix it without a court." That suggestion felt like a doorway. I called the lawyer the next day. He was a man with a soft voice and a direct manner, the kind you want on your side when papers rattle. He asked to see my documents, then told me, with careful confidence, that there were routes to challenge an improperly recorded deed, especially if the transfers had been made under questionable circumstances. He didn't promise miracles. He promised procedure and patience. We scheduled a follow-up. Meanwhile, life continued in its small, ordinary ways. I returned to the little apartment above the bakery and learned the welcome that came with a neighborhood I had thought I'd left behind. The grocer who knew my name. The woman at the laundromat who always had a kind word. The teenager who walked his dog and always tipped his hat. I mended shirts and sorted receipts and fed the cat that belonged to the lady downstairs in exchange for cheap soup and neighborly company. There was dignity in these small exchanges. They filled the hours with quiet work and small certainties. At night, I would sit with my folder of papers and read them until the edges blurred, tracing the numbers with my finger like the lines on the palm of a hand. Each canceled check was a tiny verification that I had been building something real. Each bank stamp was a witness. The ledger in my head, the one I had kept for years in that bottom drawer, suddenly became more than a memory. It became an exhibit. The ledgers, the statements, Harold's copies. Together they were a kind of map out of the place I'd been pushed into. People asked me why I didn't confront Ray directly, why I didn't stand in the doorway and demand what was mine. It wasn't fear that kept me back. It was strategy. I'd learned long ago that when a person acts in anger, they often leave a sloppy trail. When they act in secrecy, they sometimes leave an even sloppier one, because they never think they'll have to explain it. I had no intention of wasting my energy on scenes. I wanted proof, not a performance. I wanted the law's quiet authority behind me when I did what I planned to do. Days turned into weeks. The bank mail arrived with copies. Harold called with small updates as if we were both composing a slow symphony. "There's something here," he'd say, and I would feel the rise of hope like a small flame. I held myself to the patient work of organizing, noting dates, photocopying, making a notebook of everything I'd found. Receipts, neighbor statements, the old ledger with the missing handle. I even found an old deposit slip from the day I'd made a large payment with a retirement check. The slip was coffee-stained and smudged, but it was another star on my map. I practiced my calm in the mirror some evenings. "This is not a shouting matter," I'd tell my reflection. "This is a speaking one." The plan was not revenge the way you see in movies with shouting and doors slamming. It was a careful legal reclaiming. It would be measured, exact, and if possible, gracious. I am not a woman who needs to be cruel to be strong. Strength to me has always been the ability to stand steady when the wind tries to move you. By the time the lawyer called to schedule a meeting, I had a thick folder of documents and a steadier breath. He reviewed everything with a practiced eye and then, with a small, precise smile, said, "We have enough to start." It was not a theatrical line. It was a factual assessment, and it landed like a hand on my shoulder. I left his office feeling a mixture of relief and something else, a calm readiness. What I had been building behind closed doors was not a trap, but a truth. I had gathered the proof that showed where the payments had come from and the irregularity in the deed. I had Harold's notes and a handful of neighbors who would say what they knew. I had, beneath it all, the ledger of a life spent faithfully. The path forward would require time and a steady heart. But I had those things. That night I stood on the small balcony of my apartment, the city breathing its ordinary light, and I pictured the porch of our house. The rose bush would bloom again next spring, whether or not he stood beneath it. The world did not shrink around me, it opened. I felt, for the first time in a long while, the clear line between being wronged and being powerless. They are not the same. I had a plan, the kind that needed patience more than fury. I had proof, the kind that could not be bluffed away. And I had a voice I intended to use, calm and exact, when the time came to speak. The morning the first official envelope arrived, I was folding a small towel in the kitchenette of my apartment. It was one of those ordinary tasks that makes a day feel steady, a little motion that organizes more than cloth. The mail slot clinked and I slipped the towel into the drawer, expecting the usual flyers and a credit card offer. Instead, an envelope with the county seal lay on top, the paper thicker than the rest, and my name printed in a neat machine font. My heart did a small, surprised flip that I would later recognize as the beginning of something closing and opening at once. I sat down at the table, and slit the envelope with a butter knife, because it felt like a practical thing to do. The document inside was a court notice, not the kind of thunderous thing you see on television, but the slow, formal voice of the law on paper. The judge had reviewed the materials. The deed transfer Ray had recorded years before was declared invalid on the basis that it had been improperly recorded and did not reflect the true source of payments. There were references to canceled checks, bank ledgers, and testimony. The language was precise, the kind of language that doesn't dance around meanings. It said in legal terms that nevertheless felt almost gentle, that the house was legally mine. I read it twice, then 3 times, because the news felt unreal in that same way happiness sometimes does. Like a generous stranger had come and rearranged the furniture in a familiar room. Part of me wanted to call Harold immediately, to ask if the paper was real. Part of me wanted to drive to the courthouse and stand in the doorway until someone explained it in person. Mostly, I sat with the paper and folded my hands over it like I would over my grandmother's Bible. There was relief, of course, but it wasn't the dramatic sort that makes you laugh or shout. It was the slow, steady relief of someone who has been carrying a heavy load and finally set it down. When I called Harold, he chuckled softly. "I told you paperwork tells a story," he said. "You gave it the right pages, Evelyn." It listened. There was a warmth in his voice that was almost like family. I felt gratitude for him in a way that made me want to sit and knit a scarf for everyone involved. But there wasn't time for knitting now. There was a thing to do that I had imagined many nights while turning pages and lining up stamps, a practical, small act that would close a chapter in a manner that fit the life I had led. Without drama, with dignity. I called the locksmith that afternoon. He was a man with a lineage of locksmiths in his family and a soft laugh like a hinge. He met me at the house with a van that smelled faintly of oil and leather. The porch looked the way it always had, the swing slightly weathered, the rose bush bushy and a little wild at the edges. The front door had held 1,000 small comings and goings. It had kept safe the sound of a couple of people growing older together. I watched the locksmith work, his hands sure and efficient, and I felt something like a tide beginning to roll back. When he fitted the new lock and handed me the brass key, it made a little metallic click like the closing of a small private bell. I held the key like someone holding a compass, and for a moment it was heavy with everything that had happened. It was not an act of vengeance. It felt to me like the restoration of a right. The right to a place I had paid for, tended, and loved. I paid the locksmith, thanked him, and he went back to his van, leaving me on the porch with the smell of cut grass and the distant sound of a dog barking. I knew Ray would come home that night. He always did sooner or later. He moved through rhythms that were stubborn in their familiarity. Even when he tried to break from them, the town had a way of tugging him back. I had not planned to make a spectacle of his return. If there was one thing I had learned in my decades of nursing and in the quiet war I had waged with paperwork, it was that dignity seldom needed to shout. It had a clarity that was felt by the other person with a sound like a door closing softly. When the car pulled up and the garage door rattled down, I was waiting on the porch, a cup of tea steaming in my hands, though my nerves hummed under the calm like a radio left on low. Ray came up the path with his usual gait, shoulders square, a bit of a limp on his right leg he'd had since a younger accident. He had grease on his hands and a new brightness in his eyes, the kind you see when someone has been spending time with people who flatter them. He reached into his pocket for his key and fumbled with it, then frowned and tried again. The key would not catch. For a second he looked puzzled, then annoyed. He turned the key again and pressed his weight against the door like someone used to forcing stubborn things. When that did not work, his face changed in a way I had seen before. A line of surprise, then disbelief, then something like anger gathering. He pressed harder, as if his force might persuade metal into compliance. The porch light threw shadows across his face, and the house looked like a stage where small, ordinary dramas could be played out under real lights. I stood and set my cup down on the rail, keeping my movements slow and ordinary. Ray didn't look at me at first. He kept working the key as if it were a puzzle he could solve by sheer persistence. Then finally he glanced up and saw me there on the porch. For a moment he looked as though he'd forgotten I was in the picture at all. Maybe he had. The look on his face when he really saw me was a mixture of surprise and a question he hadn't realized he'd been asking for some time. How did this happen? He started, and the rest of the sentence stalled in the space between us. You were right, Ray, I said, and my voice was calm like a clock. It is time for you to move on. I watched his face as the words landed, the way a person watches photographs develop in dim light. The image slow to appear, but undeniable once it does. There was a flash of something furious, and then a softer something like grief. He opened his mouth as if to answer, to plead, perhaps to rage. But whatever he planned did not come in the form of words that night. He looked down at his hands, at the key that would not turn, at the porch where the swing rocked gently, though no one sat in it. Evelyn, he said finally, and the name came like a small request, as if he were asking permission to be heard. There was that old cadence to his voice that made your ears remember the man he had been. Familiar, raw, human. You can't do this. We can talk. You already had your turn to fix things, I said. You had time. I paid what I could. The law is clear. I was careful with the words because I wanted them to be true and simple, not loaded. I wanted the truth to sit like a table in the room, solid and factual, not a weapon. He leaned his forehead against the door, and for a moment I thought he might cry. He did not. Instead, he let out a weary breath, as though some small engine inside him had finally stalled. This isn't fair, he muttered. Not to me, but to whatever part of himself listened to confessions. Fair doesn't always match what is right, I said, and I meant that in the softest possible way. My voice held no triumph. It held instead the tired patience of someone who had learned to match actions to values. I had not come to this point to savor his loss. I had come to reclaim what had been quietly taken. He tried the key again, one last hopeful twist, and then slid his hands into his pockets and stepped back from the door. He looked at me, really looked, as if searching the years for reasons. Where will you go? He asked at last, as if the question might be a bridge. I have a place, I said. I'll be fine. It was true. I had a small apartment, a folder of documents, Harold, and a lawyer who had been practical and kind. I had friends and neighbors and the steady work that paid me more than money ever could, the steady practice of caring. He made a small laugh, more a sound of disbelief than amusement. You always were stubborn, he said, and somehow the sentence landed without malice, almost like an observation about weather. He turned then, slowly, the way a man turns when he knows he's leaving a room he was meant to guard. You could have told me, he said, not entirely a complaint, but not wholly an apology either. I would have liked to, I said, but I didn't expect you to take something in secret. He stood on the path for a long time after that, hands in his pockets, looking at the house like a man trying to trace his footprints backward and failing. Then he reached into his pocket, not for the key but for something else, perhaps courage, perhaps resignation, and he walked down the path. He didn't slam the gate. He didn't shout. He simply closed the distance between himself and the street and kept walking, the sound of his shoes weak against the pavement. When he was gone, I stood on the porch and ran my fingers along the new brass of the lock. It was cool and smooth under my touch, like the handle of a well-used instrument. I thought of the ledger drawer and the little missing handle, of the decades of pennies and prayer and overtime, of a life made up of ordinary courage. The door felt heavier, yes, but not in a way that threatened me. It felt like the place where I would sit with my tea and my books, and perhaps someday guests who would appreciate the quiet dignity of a home rebuilt. I closed the door softly behind me, and the click of the lock sounded like the end of a small sentence. The house had been quiet for a long time, but the quiet now held a different tone. Not the waiting hush of a place bracing for betrayal, but the steady calm of a thing restored. I didn't know yet what would come next. I only knew that the locks had turned, and with them, something in the air had settled into an honest pitch. The first evening I sat on that porch after the locks had been changed, the house felt familiar in the way a song you haven't heard in years feels when it comes back soft on the radio. The boards creaked the same way underfoot. The swing still had that lazy arc when you pushed it. The roses were a little scraggly from neglect, but stubbornly blooming, as if they, too, had decided this place was worth fighting for. I made tea in my own kitchen, poured it into my favorite chipped cup, and carried it out to the porch like I was bringing home an offering. The sun was low and warm, painting the oaks gold. A few children rode by, their laughter spilling across the street. Mrs. Klein waved from her window like she always did. Everything looked ordinary, and yet ordinary had a new taste to it. Quieter, cleaner, like the first breath you take after you've been holding it in for too long. I sat in the swing and let the rhythm slow my heart. For a long time, I had carried the memory of being turned away from this very door, the image of Ray closing it and walking off into a life that suddenly felt foreign. Now sitting there, the memory was sharp, but it no longer burned. People ask me sometimes what revenge felt like. I always have to think about how to answer them because the word revenge conjures fireworks and fury, things I never wanted. What I did was not for show. I didn't want to break him, and I didn't want to hurt him in ways that would make me small. I wanted what was mine returned with dignity. I wanted truth to have its say. So when the court signed the papers and the locks turned, it felt less like vengeance, and more like a bell ringing to mark the end of a long service. There were practicalities to handle afterward. Taxes, the naming on utility bills, the small legal cleanups that follow an ownership change. Harold, bless him, came by more than once with tea and a steadying hand. His smile was the kind that says, "We did the right thing." The lawyer who had taken my case pro bono sent a polite letter explaining the court's decision and what it meant. There were neighbors who reached out with casseroles, and casseroles are a kind of medicine that works better than you'd think. Life returned to a rhythm I recognized, but with new edges. I was careful about what I said and how I moved through the house because I wanted to protect the small peace I'd earned. On a warm Tuesday morning a few weeks later, a knock came at the door. I answered, and found a young woman standing there with a toddler asleep on her shoulder, hair in a messy bun, and eyes a little too watchful for peace. Her name was Mariah. She had been recommended by a friend at the clinic who knew about her situation. Single, recently out of an abusive arrangement, looking for a place that wouldn't judge her for the mistakes she'd been forced to make. When she told me her story, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, the kind that used to be for pain, but now leaned more toward action. "I'm not looking for charity," she said quickly, as if I might offer it the way someone might push broth across a table. "I just need a good place for a little while. I can pay rent. I have a job at the diner over on Main." She spoke with the kind of careful pride I respected. I could see the little child's hand twitch against her neck, the tiny fingers curled in sleep. Something in me that had been hollowed by betrayal softened. Maybe it was that I'd always believed a house is for people to heal in. Maybe it was that the muscle memory of making soup for a sick neighbor still lived deep inside me. I invited her in, made another pot of tea, and we talked until the toddler woke and smiled with the kind of bright honesty only very young children have. I chose to rent one of the rooms on the side of the house, the one with the small window that faced the rosebush. It had its own door and a little kitchenette we'd put in years ago when our daughter had stayed for a summer. We worked out a modest rent, and she beamed in a way that said this roof was not just shelter, it was a trust returned. Watching Mariah and her boy settle in, setting up a small bed, bringing in a few mismatched toys, I felt something like the turning of a page. The house, which had been a place of quiet wounds, began to fill with soft, living noise again. The clatter of a small plate, a child's hummed song, the sound of someone learning to sleep without fear. People talked, as they do in neighborhoods. Ray heard about it eventually. The town is small and sympathy has legs. I ran into him one afternoon at the hardware store. He looked thinner, older in an unkind way, but there was no melodrama when we spoke. I nodded. He stared at the tools on the shelf like a man who had misplaced his map. "I heard," he said finally, voice flat as a well-worn path. "You did what you had to." "You did what you did," I answered. I kept my tone even, because I wanted the conversation to be ordinary. There was no theatrical gain to be had in making him feel small. That wasn't my work. My work had been to put truth where truth belonged. After that, he stopped coming around. I don't know if he moved. People change their addresses for many reasons. I heard rumors of a place 2 counties over where he had found work fixing up an old garage. I felt a small human spike of pity for him. Pity not because he'd lost anything I'd gained, but pity because he had been swallowed by something uglier than regret. A loneliness that comes from having asked for more than you are willing to give. Days became a comfortable patchwork of small tasks and simple pleasures. I planted a new few roses by the porch, pruning the old stems the way you coax sleep from sore joints. Carefully, patiently. I kept my ledger, not because the house demanded it, but because it was a habit that reminded me of what steady work looks like. I would sit at the table in the morning with the light coming through the window and write little notes, reminders to myself to call Harold, to check the water heater, to bake a loaf for Mariah's family. My life had the kind of ordinary order that felt like resilience. At night, I'd sit on the porch and watch the neighborhood settle. Sometimes Mariah would be out there too, pushing the stroller gently, talking to her boy about the colors of clouds. Once she brought me a basket of bread she'd baked in thanks. "You saved us," she said, and there was no dramatics in it, only honest gratitude. I accepted the bread as I had accepted the court's decision, quietly, gratefully, with an awareness that the real work was not in the moment of victory, but in what we did after. People think justice must come with fireworks, with a loud, cinematic reveal. But the kind of justice that matters most to me is the quiet kind that rearranges the life around the hurt until the hurt no longer shapes your days. I didn't throw Ray out like a villain in a story. I reclaimed a life he'd tried to reframe on a piece of paper. I opened the door to the next chapter, with hands that had learned to steady themselves again. There were afternoons when sorrow braided itself into the light, a photograph I'd find tucked in a book, a song on the radio that we used to sing along to, a shirt still folded in the linen closet that smelled a little like him. Those things would come and go, and I would let them, because to pretend they didn't exist would be to pretend I had not loved once in a wide and ordinary way. But love and ownership are not always the same. You can give someone your heart and still keep the house you paid for. You can forgive someone for who they became without inviting them back into your home, as if nothing had happened. As summer edged toward fall, the porch became a kind of small stage for healing. The roses flushed, the cicadas quieted, and at dusk my cup of tea would steam in the cooling air. Neighbors would drift by and talk about weather and grandchildren and that old baseball team that had lost more than it won but had heart. I would reply, slow and sure, each word a little reinforcement of the life I'd chosen. Once, an old friend asked me how I could live in the same house after everything. "Wouldn't it be too much?" she asked. I thought about it for a long time and then said, "No, the house remembers what you built. The memories don't vanish because someone else tried to rename them. I wanted this place to hold the life I have left, not the hurt someone tried to lay on it." She nodded like she understood, because she knew something about making a life out of small things. The truth is, there's a tenderness to this kind of ending. It isn't triumphant in a trumpet way. It's more like the hush of a well-tended garden after a storm has passed. You walk through, picking up the pieces of what you can use, planting new seeds where old roots had been damaged. You let time do what it does best. Smooth edges, teach patience, give the heart room to forgive itself for what it had to leave behind. If there's a lesson in what I did, it isn't that quiet always wins or that the law is always kind. The lesson is simpler. Small, steady actions accumulate into a life that can hold more than one story. Pay your bills if you can. Keep your receipts. Keep friends who will read your paperwork without judging your courage. Stand so you're ready to act when the time calls for it. And if you have to change locks, do it because you deserve the safety of your own home. not as a way to hurt someone who has already hurt you. So now when the sun sets and the porch light comes on, I sit with my tea and watch young families cross the street, and I think about the life we all build, how fragile it can be, how durable when tended. I think about Mariah humming to her boy and how the house now holds 2 generations asking small questions about the world. I think about Harold's steady hands and the lawyer's calm voice, and how a small circle of ordinary people can reroute a life. If you liked this kind of quiet story, if you know someone who might find comfort in it, consider liking and sharing. And if you want more stories where patience meets justice, subscribe. These are the kinds of small, true things that keep us company on long evenings. Thank you for sitting with me on this porch for a while.